Good morning, Jonas. Good morning, everyone in and around the courtroom. This is case IT 0891T, the prosecutor versus Mićo Stanišić and Stojan Župljanin.
Thank you, Madam Registrar. Good morning to everyone. May we have the appearances, please?
Good morning, Your Honor. Can you hear me? For the prosecution, I'm Tom Hannes. To my left is our case manager, Sebastian van Hooijdonk. To my right, Joanna Corner, Matthew Olmsted, Rafael La Cruz, and Alexis Demirjian. And on the back row, the two gentlemen are a couple of our interns, Edin Cengic and Nedim Muminovic is closest to the court reporter. Thank you.
Good morning, Your Honors. Slobodan Zečević, Slobodan Cvjetić, Eugene O'Sullivan, and Ms. Tatjana Savić appearing for Stanišić defense this morning. Thank you.
Good morning, Your Honors. Dragan Krgović, Aleksandar Aleksić, Michelle Butler, Miroslav Ćuškić, Milena Đudović, and Joyce Bukenstein appearing for Župljanin defense today.
Thank you. Before we begin, we've been alerted that the parties may wish to raise a housekeeping matter with reference to tomorrow's scheduling.
Your Honours, that was going to be me, but I've spoken to the defence about the matter, which was the possibility of starting at 9 o'clock by going to courtroom 3. I had, of course, completely forgotten that Mr. Krgović is in the case which is being heard before, and so, unfortunately, it doesn't look as though we can do anything about that.
Thank you.
Your Honours, I asked Mr. Hannes very kindly if I may encroach for 5 minutes on his time just to deal with two matters relating to Župljanin that I, in my rush to try and finish, I meant to deal with yesterday. Your Honours will recall that I referred to a document which he had sent to the Minister on the 20th of July. And can I ask that document P583 be put up? This is a document which is addressed, in fact, to the Minister, or it's addressed to the MUP, but headed underneath that for the Minister, although it's not on the part we've got up in the screen. And it begins by talking about the armed conflicts between the forces of the Serbian Republic and the Muslim Croat. And the first sentence reads, "We have informed you about the progress and the results of those conflicts on a regular basis." As I said, Mr. Hannes will be dealing with the matter of communications in a moment. It then goes on to deal with the various categories of people who have been imprisoned. It talks about, as you will see on the screen, the yes, I'm sorry, Your Honours. I'm going to ask, I'm sorry, I'm afraid that's my fault. We've obviously got the wrong bits up. Could we put up the whole document instead? It makes it easier. Yes. Thank you. As you will see, dated the 20th of July, and there's the sentence I've just referred to. And then it goes on to deal with the numbers of people arrested. And it talks about the three categories, and Your Honours will recall those categories are referred to in various documents that emanate from Prijedor and Sanski Most. And at the bottom of that paragraph, the last sentence, the third category, is made of adult men on which so far the service doesn't have any information of security interest for us, so they can be treated as hostages.
Ms. Gona, who sends this letter?
If we go to the bottom, Your Honours will see the next page, it's sent by Župljanin.
Thank you.
And Your Honours, it then goes on to suggest various solutions. Perhaps we just look at those solutions that we can see on that page. The charges should be raised against persons for whom the service has documented proof. Persons, old persons, if any of them assume a decisive attitude. Now, Your Honours, what we say is that this whole document is indicative of Župljanin's attitude towards the prisoners, his knowledge as well, that it doesn't say release them. It says assume a decisive attitude. To exchange military men of no security interest to us who can be treated as hostages. And Your Honours, we say that whole document exemplifies the attitude of Župljanin towards these prisoners.
Ms. Horner, your highlighting of this paragraph, this concluding phrase in this paragraph, apart from anything that might have been, any concepts that may have been lost in the translation, what comes over in the English, what in your submission is that intended to convey?
The suggestions. Yes. Your Honours, we say instead of, in particular, paragraph 2, instead of saying part of the defence case against Mr. Župljanin is that he didn't know about prisoners, and when he did know, he was prepared to deal with them in a proper manner and have them released. We say this document shows the very contrary. He's not doing anything of the sort. He's talking about hostages. He's talking about assume a decisive attitude. And all of this is being sent to the minister, his co-accused, Mićo Stanišić. I hope that's clear, Your Honours. And Your Honours, we say that one of the points that is made, if you look, and we'll come back to that at the very end of what we say, is that the defence urge upon Your Honours in their final brief that he took all steps that he was able to comply with the law and not to in any way allow any crimes to be committed or go undetected or unpunished. And we say this is very far from what the documentation produced at the time reveals. Your Honours, finally, can we ask that Your Honours look at a very short video clip, P2065. This is Župljanin and others being interviewed on January the 12th, 1993, about effectively the security situation. One of the other people in the studio is, in fact, then the Assistant Minister, Tomo Kovac, and I think Your Honours will see a quick clip of him as he looked like in 1992. We just have play that part.
Iako sada govorimo o funkcionisanju pravne države, iako jasno dajemo do znanja da država mora da funkcioniše bez obzira na sve prepreke koje se postavljaju pred nju, moram reći i konstatovati da pojedini organi su u ovom vremenskom periodu obavljali i druge poslove i zadatke, izuzev oni koji su im strogo zakonom stavljeni u nadležnost, takvi su bili organi službe bezbjednosti. To je nametala sama situacija po sebi. Sasvim je normalno da tamo gdje se vode borbena dejstva, gdje se štiti prije svega čovjek, gdje se štite građani na odgovarajućem prostoru, moraju aktivno da učešće uzmu i pripadnici organa i službi bezbjednosti. Ja želim samo da upoznam javnost da su do sada 91% aktivnog i rezervnog sastava uzela aktivno učešće u borbenim dejstvima, da smo svjesni da službu narod nikada neće prihvatiti kao svoju ukoliko služba ne izraste iz rata, da nažalost imamo dosta gubitaka. Tako, na primjer, do sada imamo 112 poginulih, imamo 314 teško povrijeđenih, a o lakše povrijeđenih da i ne govorimo. To je najbolji dokaz koliko su se pripadnici organa i službi bezbjednosti aktivno uključili u stvaranje Republike Srpske i koliko su svjesni da nam je prioritetan zadatak da stvorimo ovu državu, a poslije ćemo onim pojavama koji štetno utiču na samu.
Well, there we see Župljanin saying exactly what the prosecution says, that the police did as they say they did, they tasks which normally would have been outside their responsibility, which would be the guarding of camps, where they say this was a necessity because of as they put it, the citizens are to be protected on specific territory. And thank you very much for the extra time.
Your Honors, this morning I want to begin by talking about communications, a matter that's been discussed a lot in this courtroom, or more often in courtroom 3, I guess, during the past couple of years. On the screen, the first slide I want to show you list some of the various means and modes of communication that were available to the accused and to the RS MOOP in 1992. They had telephones, fax machines, teletype and teleprinters for sending coded communications, had shortwave and ultra-shortwave radios. When necessary, they could use human beings as couriers. There were frequent face-to-face meetings and collegiums at both the headquarters level and CSB levels. And in addition to the MOOP's countrywide communication system, there were 2 other republic-wide communication systems that could be used by the MOOP. One was the Army system once the VRS was in place, and there was also the Ministry of Defense, which had its Republic Communications Center. You'll recall Mr. Vukovic, who worked there, testified about that system. It was primarily for the use of the Republic-level political organs, but they had the means to communicate with all the municipalities. He testified that all 3 of those communication providers assisted each other from time to time as needed and as necessary. I'll just give you one example of the use of an alternative communications network. Mr. Tutush testified at page 7712 about a time when he needed to get in touch with the minister. The communication system in Banja Luka was having some problems on that occasion. So he went to the center, and reading from line 6 on that page, he said, I couldn't directly contact the minister, so I went to the communications center. I asked the operator to connect me with the minister through other means of communication that Republika Srpska had at its disposal at the time. And he did put me through to General Tolomir through some sort of military communications. And from Tolomir, I asked the connection to Stanišić. 10 minutes later or less, I got feedback from General Tolomir that Mr. Stanišić agreed with my decision. That's just one example of the alternative means being used. Vukovic's testimony has more detail, and that's at transcript 1761 through 24, 17655, and 17691 to 92. In addition, you've heard how part of the problem was that the post telegraph and telephone system, the PTT system, was disrupted because of the war and the division of territory. You have in evidence one reference pertaining to that system in Exhibit P-1755, General Miladic's notebook regarding a meeting on the 31st of July. He receives a report from the Chief of Communications for his Herzegovina Corps at page 393 and 394 of both the English and the BCS in E-Court. The Chief reports the communication system is fully operational, and on 394 he reports that the PTT system of the SAOH, the Serbian Autonomous Region of Herzegovina, is better now than before the war. That's the report on the 31st of July. Now, if we could go to the next slide. If you really need or want to do some more research into the state of communications, there are several sources that you can look at. There are various annual reports. The RS MOOP annual report, P625, we'll look more at that in a minute. P624 is the annual report for Banja Luka CSB. The testimony of the various communication witnesses, Mr. Vukovic I mentioned.
I'm sorry, Mr. Hannes, just for this, the sake of record, you said 625 and 624, and it was recorded 264 and 265. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think it's important for you.
Thank you. That's correct. I did think I said and intended to say 625 and 624. The communication witnesses, including Mr. Vukovic or Mr. Kazunovic from RS MOOP at the top level, Mr. Pejic, who worked in the CSB in Sarajevo, Mr. Rakovic in CSB Banja Luka, Mr. Jankovic from Prijedor, and Mr. Raljic from Kotovaroš. A couple of the logbooks. I've spared you all the pain of me bringing any logbooks and trying to discuss them today. But again, I would encourage you to have a look at them. P1428 is the communications logbook that was initially used in Vratsa by Mr. Kazunovic at the MOOP headquarters level. And then later you heard that very same notebook was taken over and used as the logbook for CSB Sarajevo by Mr. Pejic. That one, if you would look at some of the testimony of Mr. Pejic, we walked through several of the links. And P1025 is the Prijedor logbook that we spent a lot of time with Mr. Jankovic. Intercepts were another means of communication. And you have a number of intercepts in evidence. I think the defense all along and still in their brief try to argue about the weight of that evidence and still have an issue with them. I think your honors should be well satisfied by now that that evidence is something reliable. A number of those have been confirmed by the actual speakers. Many of them are self-authenticating to a certain extent just based on their contents. The caller comes, you hear him ask, may I speak with Mr. Stanišić? Someone comes on the phone and says he's Mr. Stanišić. They have a conversation about something we know about from either other telephone conversations or other documents that make sense in the context of the date and the events that are going on. And we think you can rely on those. Collegiums, we have 6 RS MOOP collegiums, July, August, September, October, and November, and a reference to the one in December. We don't have the actual minutes to that, but we have documents referring to it both before it occurred and after it occurred. And you can see from those collegiums that there must have been other communications prior to the meetings. You can't get a group of people together unless the meeting is scheduled and people are informed that they need to come and attend. And the fact that they did occur indicates prior communications and the contents of the collegium. You see what they're talking about. You see that they've had prior communications about those kinds of things. Assembly sessions. The Bosnian Serb Assembly met several times in 1992. You can see from those lengthy conversations in some of the assembly sessions that there's been a lot of communication, not only among the delegates, but with other people outside the assembly, including police and army personnel. And likewise, government sessions. I think there are some 60 government sessions in evidence. We may not have all 60, but there are approximately that many. Mr. Stanišić was a member of the government as the Minister of Interior in 1992. He often attended. When he's not present, his absence is generally noted, and one of his representatives is attending. I think on one occasion, Mr. Kovac, Mr. Njegus, various people whose names you will recognize as members of the MOOP headquarters. Now, and we have more details about the communication in our final trial brief in paragraphs 881 through 886. I refer you there for further detail. And if we could go to the next slide, this is P625, the MOOP draft annual report. There are two sections that deal with communications. This first one was entitled Reporting and Informing. This, I believe, has more to do with the section of the MOOP that dealt with analysis, where they sent out requests for information, or they sent out questionnaires, they received information back, and prepared reports. You see from this excerpt, taken from pages 22 and 23 of the English in P625, 31 and 32 in the BCS, talks about a number of reports that were prepared during the year, and concerning reporting and informing, some 4,170 dispatches were sent to the centers and other organs, and about 4,400 were received. Now, this is different from the next slide. This is also in the report. Section 3 was about tasks and duties of communications and cryptographic data protection. I see the numbers here of dispatches sent and received. In addition to the dispatches, it notes that some 9,585 shortwave radio connections were established from the communications center base alone. Again, this is for the period from April through December 92. Related to that, we should look at the next slide, which is the report for the period from 4 April 92 to 31 April 92 for the CSB in Banja Luka. And again, we'll have two different types of communication and reporting. This first one you have on the slide is the cryptographic data protection and communication system. There were a total of 15,981 dispatches received. That includes both the open and closed or coded dispatches, if my math is right. And something near 14,339 were sent. That's a total of both the open and closed dispatches. In addition to that, it notes that they forwarded 2,297 dispatches. You may recall evidence we heard where on occasion, for example, I think Zvornik was one, where they were not able to communicate with Sarajevo, but they were able to communicate with Bijeljina, and they requested that Bijeljina forward a dispatch to Sarajevo. I believe that this is what's happening in Banja Luka as well. Sometimes they were requested to forward a dispatch that another unit could not connect with at the time. Go to the next slide. Still in P624, the report for Banja Luka, CSB, this is about task and assignments concerning analysis and information. I think this is the same that was seen in the MOOP headquarters report concerning reporting and informing. A total of 111 reports on security issues were submitted to government organs and municipalities. 206 reports were submitted to the Army. 632 reports to the MOOP, I assume that means MOOP headquarters, from CSB Banja Luka. And the bottom paragraph, you see the Center's Professional Council held regular meetings. This is the collegium on the CSB level, an example of communications occurring at that level. We could go one more slide. And just want to touch briefly on some of the defense claims regarding communications that were made during the trial. There was a reference to the extreme drop-off in the number of dispatches as a reflection of the difficulties that RS MOOP was having in '92. And I think Mr. Kozunovic was the first one that this was put to, that, gee, before the war, wasn't there about 300,000 dispatches a year? And here in his report, you only see 4,000 or 8,000, some much smaller number. First of all, we don't have a document reflecting what the number was in 1991 or the first 3 months of '92. And we only have that bare testimony. In addition, you remember before the split, the MOOP of Bosnia covered more than the 70 or so municipalities that we eventually had in the RS. It was something in the neighborhood, I think, of 110 or 109 municipalities is the evidence about the total territory. In addition, I think Mr. Page is the one who told us that before the war, there were all kinds of dispatches that were sent that simply did not get sent during the wartime for some pretty obvious reasons. If you're engaged in a war, it's probably not worth your time or effort to be sending out a dispatch to try and locate a stolen bicycle or a car or other kinds of sort of routine police business that is done during peacetime. In addition, there were obviously fewer policemen working in the RS MOOP because it was a smaller area, fewer personnel, so there are fewer policemen to actually be doing police work that requires reporting and sending dispatches about. And for security reasons, Mr. Page, I think, also mentioned this, that there were more comms, more communications done outside the dispatch system. You've seen from some of the intercepts that the speakers were aware that oftentimes they were being eavesdropped on. You heard the expressions of concern about sending dispatches by fax for security reasons. And so much more of the communication occurred either by face-to-face communication or outside the dispatch system. Mr. Page, at transcript page 12129 and 12130. 12130. Before the war, dispatches that went from the soup toward the centers and police stations could include 100 or 200 dispatches in a packet because dispatches are used to inform relevant institutions of all security relevant matters, such as stolen vehicles, whereas during wartime, those wouldn't be so numerous. He went on to say, but it was expected the number of dispatches about security relevant events become much greater But such information was, however, mostly transmitted by phone or in direct contact between the officers, and dispatches were used only when other means of communication were not possible. I believe that the officers in charge compensated for that through telephone communications or other types of communications. The second remark was the 30% increase to be expected during the war was a suggestion, I think, initially put by Mr. Zečević to one or more of the communication witnesses. We never heard a basis for that estimate, and I fail to see what that could possibly be based on. None of the witnesses had been in the experience of going through a war in their former country and comparing the communications with peacetime communications. It seems like a completely wild, out-of-the-air guess and has no basis that you can rely on. Finally, completely cut off was a phrase I think we heard often from witnesses about the situation regarding communications. They were not completely cut off. People got around. Mr. Stanišić and all the RS big shots, Mr. Karadžić, Koljević, Krajnik, Mrs. Plavšić, Trbojević, and Jerić, including the RS assembly members, were able to travel around. They all showed up in Banja Luka on May 12th for the assembly session. And you'll see from the assembly sessions they met at various locations throughout the RS in 1992. I guess one of the best examples I would refer you to in what it was generally like for the police and communications in 1992 comes from the testimony of ST 179 at T 74 72 through 76. He basically said at the beginning of the conflict they used couriers for communication. By June, the telephones were working. By August, teleprinter and telegraph was working. He also said that the SJB chiefs had periodic, at least monthly, meetings with their CSB chief, including one that was held at the Hotel Kossuth, where Mr. Stanišić had his office at the time. And at those meetings, the SJB chiefs would regularly inform the CSB chief about events and steps that needed to be taken, and that the CSB chief would draw conclusions and forward them to the minister, Mr. Stanišić. Your Honors, I guess that's where I want to sum up. Yes, there were problems with communications, and there were difficulties. But one thing I like about communications witnesses generally, compared to politicians or policemen or generals from the Army in this kind of case, is that the communication guys are engineers. And their job is to figure out how to make things work, not to have a discussion about whether it should work or who's going to be in charge of it working or whatever. They try to solve problems. And that's what they did. When the telephone didn't work, then they tried to set up a radio relay connection. They used couriers. They delivered messages face-to-face. It's obvious that communications were occurring. They weren't ideal. They never are. But you can see from the totality of the evidence, the people who needed to know got the information. Maybe not as quickly as they would have liked in the ideal circumstance, but it was not the situation the defense would have you believe it's some kind of prehistoric situation with no communications, or post-apocalyptic situation where everything's been destroyed and they have to resort to signal flares and smoke signs. Communications worked. Now let me talk about Mr. Stanišić, unless there's a particular question. Now I want to talk about Mićo Stanišić, Minister of the Interior for the RS MUP in 1992, and back for a while in 1994. First slide, character evidence. In his brief, Mr. Stanišić has put character into evidence. I would point out that good character is not a defense to the charges. Might be a factor you consider for mitigation in sentencing, but it is not a defense of charges. Good people sometimes do bad things. But, indeed, the character witnesses cited in the defense brief at paragraphs 20 and 41 includes some folks that I would highly suggest to you are not the most reliable witnesses that have appeared here, including Mr. Machar, Mr. Planojević, Mr. Žepinić. And it's odd that Mr. Stanišić refers to Žepinić as one of his character witnesses on the one hand, and then when it comes to Mr. Žepinić's evidence in transcript 5828 through 5832 about the incident where he says Mr. Stanišić pulled a gun on him, they ask you to completely disregard that. But I would say there's other evidence that suggests that Mr. Žepinić may be telling you the truth about that, and that it's not out of character for Mr. Stanišić in 1992. You heard some testimony about the loud argument and confrontation between Mr. Stanišić and Mr. Đerić. Đerić talked about that at transcript 2583. We had some partial corroboration that such a event occurred from Mr. Trbojević at transcript 41, 22, and 23. And a third person, ST 127, at transcript 11, 912 through 913, told you a detailed example. Reading from line 17 of 11, 912. His driver called me up from Yaharina and told me that the minister had ordered me to wait for him in the room where we met last. And I was there. He came. He was extremely angry, furious, which surprised me greatly. I was flabbergasted. I entered the room, and Mr. Stanišić, I don't know how to put it. It would be a bad thing for me to say that he shouted or hollered, but it was terrible for a highly educated man in such a high position, the way he behaved. I felt like a slave. I didn't dare move. He walked up and down the room, shouting, accusing me of obstructing this or that, and I didn't know what could happen at any moment. And it went on for an hour at least. And I know once it was over, nobody could be found in the neighboring offices. In those angry outbursts and in issuing threats to me, he went on, and I noticed that he was armed. He had a pistol in a holster, and he touched that holster several times. And I didn't know that, what he might be able to do. I had never seen him like that. And finally, he said to me extremely angrily that on the following morning I would be out in the trenches with the military somewhere on Mount Yaharina. So 3 different sources talking about that aspect of his character. And one intercept. This is the next slide I would like to show you. It's a phone call on the 18th of April, 1992, between Minister Stanišić and Radomir Kojić. We'll talk about him a little bit later. And you'll see that Mr. Kojić is informing him about another individual named Zoka who's arrested certain people, and they've made an agreement that those people will be brought to Vaca and handed over. He says they can beat them, they can do whatever they fucking want, and then we will move them because we have no space here Mr. Stanisić's reaction was, fine. Now, let me go to the next slide. The defense pointed out that Mr. Stanišić cooperated with the OTP. Again, if anything, that goes perhaps to mitigation for sentencing if there's a conviction. But from a reading of the totality of the interview, it's our position that the cooperation was more in the nature of an effort to try and make the case against him go away. We believe a fair reading of the interview shows that he was less than fully forthcoming. And if you would take the time, Your Honors, I would encourage you to look at P2309 at pages 26 through 35 in the English to give you a little flavor of the interview. Mr. Tiger, the prosecutor at the time, who was asking him about the minutes of the 11 July Collegium in Belgrade and the subsequent 17 July analysis and conclusions taken from that meeting. In particular, asking him about what Mr. Župljanin had said about the numerous Muslims who had been rounded up by the army and the crisis staff, who were trying to round up as many as possible and putting them in these undefined camps under miserable conditions. And in the conversation, the way the questions and answers went, I think illustrates that he was not really cooperating. He quibbled with Mr. Tiger's reference to the number of people being detained as many, and insisted on a number. When Mr. Tiger suggested that those people were victims, he said, "Who do you mean?" Mr. Tiger had to clarify, "I mean those Muslims that you agreed were being held in those camps without any criminal charges against them." Please have a look. A couple of other instances in the interview I want to refer to just to try and illustrate the point. Next slide, please. He was asked if he was involved in any operational aspects of what the MUP was doing during the time he was at Raca, which you will recall was in the first few weeks of the war. His answer was, the minister is not involved in the operation aspect. It's the minister's duty to provide guidelines for the work of MUP and to adopt legal regulations. But what did he actually do while he was at Raca? You'll see it was more in the nature of some operational work. If we could go to the next slide. There are a series of intercepts. I'm not going to put them all up in the interest of my limited time, but you have him speaking directly with Mr. Karadžić, who was head of the RS MUP Special Unit. In the first instance, on 1 July, he tells him to destroy those targets. The next day, he's telling him, take them down, screw them, do not take any risks, just take them down. Again, get down those targets. And the last one is not a conversation with Mr. Stanišić, but with Karadžić and Mr. Kuzmuk, who at the time was the Assistant Minister for Police Administration. Mr. Karadžić is requesting Kuzmuk to get a particular TAM, a vehicle with an anti-aircraft gun, and Mr. Kuzmuk advising that can only be done with the approval or permission of the minister. So the minister is involved in the operational aspects of the work at that time. Next slide, please. Also in the interview, there was a discussion about the relationship between the minister and his subordinates and how there were difficulties caused by the political authorities, the crisis staffs. And Mr. Stanišić said, all the time, up until their dissolution, the Serb autonomous districts, which happened in September, The head of CSBs, as well as the heads of the police stations, did not merely hold the position of head of CSBs or police stations. They were also members of crisis staffs and war presidencies. And a little further down, he goes on to say, and because the minister did not have de facto jurisdiction during that period of time, here's my emphasis added, you cannot find a single order of the head of the CSBs or the head of the police stations referring to any order of mine or any of my assistants between April and September. You may remember off the top of the head, we have many orders of the minister and from some of his assistants that are referred to specifically in orders of the CSBs and referred on down to the SJBs. We'll show you a few. If we could go 2 slides over. 1D73 is an exhibit that is the 25 April order from Minister Stanišić, numbered 01-25, delegating his authority regarding appointment of certain personnel to CSB chiefs. We have in evidence P384, which is Mr. Župljanin forwarding that order, which referring to that order specifically in his appointment of Mr. Ručinić as the chief of Sanski Most SJB. It's also cited by the Doughboy chief, Mr. Bielcević, in 1D464, his appointment of the deputy for CSB, Mr. Milan Savić, who you'll recall associated with the Mićo. P1004 is Mr. Stanišić's order of May 4th, and again, you'll see that that was forwarded by Mr. Župljanin, referred to by number, and it shows up in the Prijedor logbook. 1D58 is Mr. Stanišić's 7 July order to take measures against MOOP members who commit criminal acts. Again, cited by Mr. Župljanin, forwarded to Prijedor, appearing in the logbook. It's also cited by CSB Chief Krsto Savić and forwarded to his subordinate SJBs. Those are only a few examples of the orders from Mr. Stanišić between April and September. So clearly, that statement in his interview was not true. Next slide. This is only a small one. This was when Mr. Tiger was asking Mr. Stanišić about the events when the 400 or so prisoners from Bratnac were brought to Pale. You may recall that testimony. And Mr. Stanišić claimed that he didn't know about that he was out of town. The evidence in the case is this occurred on the 15th and 16th of May. Mr. Tiger pressed Mr. Stanišić for information about where he was, where he had been during the time. He said, well, sir, I just wasn't there, and I should disclose this thing during the procedure of presenting evidence. We don't know where he was. We know that on the 12th of May, he was in Banja Luka. You see him at the parade, the police parade, the day that the assembly met. We know that on the 15th of May, he was writing his order creating war units, 1D146. And we know on the 16th of May, he was writing a follow-up order about reporting about war crimes against Serb victims. But we don't know where he was. Škapina says that he did tell Mr. Stanišić about the Bratnac group the day after they were transported, but no further information. Finally, if we could go to the next slide on the interview. One more. Again, this is when Mr. Tiger was asking about the July 11th collegium. Mr. Stanišić said, Mr. Teager, since they are documents and the concept of my defense hinges on the documents, I would prefer not to discuss them at this time. I had some documents that I would prefer not to disclose. You need to understand the defense hinges on a certain strategy, keeping undisclosed and keeping with rules of undisclosing documents since I am accused. Now, Your Honors, the defense pointed out in the brief that under the statute and the Celibici judgment, it's inappropriate to comment on a defendant's non-testifying. However, I found no tribunal jurisprudence dealing with the situation we have here, where the accused has chosen to waive his right and speak. His interview in 2007 was done pursuant to the rules. He was cautioned before each and every session. His lawyer was present with him. And so he did speak about a number of matters. But he spoke selectively. And we say, based on jurisdiction from other domestic jurisdictions, the U.S., Australia, elsewhere, that in that case, when a defendant partially waives his right, he cannot use that as a sword. I see Mr. Zečević on his feet.
I'm sorry, Your Honors, I have to object to this because it is. I mean, perhaps I will give the reasons later, but I think this line is quite in contrast with the jurisprudence of this tribunal, because the tribunal jurisprudence is very clear about the fact that there is, and the statute for that purpose, that the accused cannot be compelled to testify in this case.
Well, it's an argument, Mr. Zečević. So
thank you.
We hear Mr. Hannes, and we would consider it just like all the other arguments.
Thank you, Your Honors. This may again raise the issue that Ms. Corner spoke about before, that maybe there be a request for some further submissions on particular legal matters that we can do outside the framework of the argument. But I did want to point this out because we think that in these circumstances where the defendant has made some statements and made certain assertions about what he has or what he might show, and then he doesn't, that we can comment on that to you, and that's something you can consider at least related to his credibility or to what weight to give the statement that he did make. The one U.S. Supreme Court case I would cite to you is Rylander versus United States, 103 Supreme Court, 1548, a case in 1983. The holding there was, in the U.S., our constitutional privilege that applies to the Fifth Amendment, the protection against self-incrimination. Rylander held that an accused could not convert the privilege from a shield against compulsory self-incrimination, which it was intended to be. You cannot convert that into a sword whereby a claimant asserting the privilege would be freed from adducing proof in support of a burden which would otherwise have been here. And yes, and there are several cases from Australia and England, but I want to move on to more factual matters. All right. If we could go to the slide on background. 4 brief topics I want to touch concerning background raised by the defense. SDS, Arming, Council of Ministers, National Security Council. Defense have argued that Mr. Stanišić was not a member of the SDS. We think the evidence shows that he was. If he wasn't a card-carrying member, he was certainly an important affiliate, associate, supporter, and fan of the SDS. We would ask you to look at P883. This is referred to in the defense in Mr. Stanisić's brief at paragraph 34, pointing out the mistranslation. It originally referred to a list of people as members of the SDS, and he pointed out that the correct translation should be cadre of the SDS. I'm not sure how that helps. My understanding of cadre refers to members of an organization who are the core members, the key members, around whom you would build your group. Comes from, as I understand it, the Latin quadro, meaning square. So the fact is, Mr. Stanišić is listed as being part of the cadre of the SDS, holding a position in the ministries. You can also look at P1467 and P522, which shows his involvement or connection with SDS activities. 522, his being listed as a member of the crisis staff of the SDS for the city of Sarajevo, and being assigned a task that arises from the December 19th instructions, the variant A and B instructions. He claims he never saw it, but he's listed and assigned a task that would be appropriate for him in his position at the time. P1467 is a 25 September 91 decision of the SDS appointing a regionalization staff and naming Mr. Stanišić to that. And I guess the best argument is whether he's a member or not. He's certainly a supporter, and that's found in a statement he made at the Assembly on the 23rd and 24th of November. It's from P4100 at pages 15. Yes. He says he's here to stress this to you as well, that I, as a man, have followed policies of the SDS, presidency, and our deputies in the former state. I have always followed these policies. Those who want to separate me from them, I will always be with them until it's shown that their wishes and intentions differ from those of the people. That was on the 23rd and 24th of November, 92. Let me talk a little bit about Army. The best example of this is also a comment from an assembly session, but this one comes from his colleague, Mr. Mandić. If we could go to the next slide. This is from an assembly session on the 30th and 31st of December 93, P1990, English page 164, BCS page 197. Mr. Mandić is speaking. Vito, meaning Zepinic here, I believe, Vito and Deli Mustafic, it is true, gentlemen, that they want to put me in prison. And do you know why? Because together with Stanišić, I pulled out 560 hecklers from the MUP to Romania and distributed them to Sokolac, Rogatica, Han Piesak, and Pale. You've heard other evidence or references to Mr. Stanišić and Army, including some discussion of that in an intercept or two. Council of Ministers. Mr. Stanišić was a member of the Council of Ministers, initially a minister without portfolio. Well, I see in the transcript at page 23, line 2, it says P4100. It should be P400 is the exhibit number for that assembly session in November. Now, as a member of the Ministerial Council, Mr. Stanišić attended the very first meeting held on 11 January. You'll see this in document P-268. And at that session, if we could go to the next slide. Oh, I see it's on the screen now. You'll see that the conclusion under number 2 about the priorities for the council ministers included the defining of ethnic territory, establishment of government organs in the territory, and the economic disempowerment of the current authorities in the Socialist Republic of BiH. We could go to the next slide. On the next page of the document, it mentions that a working group is going to be composed, and Mr. Stanišić is responsible for the work of the group, even though Mr. Župljanin is in the group, and Mr. Župljanin is the highest-ranking Serb in the joint MUP at the time. Mr. Stanišić is designated to be responsible for the work of this group, which is to deal with issues regarding the organization and scope of national security and frame a concept about it. You'll see shortly thereafter in, I think, the next meeting of the Council of Ministers that they come up with a proposal for the creation of a National Security Council, which indeed is what happened. And the Minister of the Interior was an ex officio member of the National Security Council. And Mr. Stanišić did work with that body. The defense, in their brief, say that, well, the National Security Council wasn't really a body with any authority. It didn't have any executive authority. It was only advisory. I think if you review all the evidence that it was something more than a mere advisory body, in effect, it acted in the place of a presidency during that interim in the early part of '92 before an RS presidency was actually created. On that, I would refer you to the testimony of Mr. Đukanović, later on a Republic War Commissioner, at one time the Minister for Youth and Sports, I believe was his title in the RS. His testimony at page 35, 69, and 70. He's speaking about in the first few weeks of the war, he was at Raca, and he was present at a meeting in late April or early May where Mr. Karadžić was in Raca. Mr. Stanišić was at this meeting. He believed that Mr. Karadžić was there as well. And he said, at line 1 on 3570, the people there were interested in the Serb side cutting the city in two. In other words, to divide the city from Raca towards Skinderia by the football pitch. And I think somebody mentioned this to Mr. Karadžić. And Karadžić replied that he could not issue an order to that effect. That is something that would have to be decided by the Council for National Security. So here you have early discussion of what turned out to be one of the 6 strategic objectives, dividing the city of Sarajevo, and Mr. Karadžić indicating that that was something that he couldn't decide, but it would have to be decided by the Council of National Security. This is in late April or early May. Next slide, please. A plan to split the BIH MOOC. Ms. Corner has spoken about this during her presentation on the introduction. And as already mentioned, indication of this can be found, another indication about the fact that there was a plan, I think is reflected in some of the year-end reports from various MOOP SJBs. I would urge you to look at the Priador SJB report, P689. Mr. Durliach is reporting about the covert preparations outside the station in early 1992, covertly forming Serbian police stations and arming Serbian personnel. P348 is the Zvornik annual report. It also referred to the illegal activity of Serbian personnel in the MUP in making plans for a potential separate Serbian MUP. And you may recall with Mr. Kovac, we showed him some of the award nominations that were put forward for him, talking about his involvement in illegal activity in arming the Serbs and making preparations for creating a new Serbian MUP. It's almost as though it's a point of pride in these reports. And again, that counters a defense argument that there was no plan and that they only were trying to go along with Cutolero. Doesn't make sense. Next, Stanisic's authority. Clearly, Mr. Stanišić had the power to appoint and replace CSB and SJB chiefs. You heard Mr. Kovac talk about that. You've seen his order from 25 April in 1D73. Mr. Olmsted will talk about this in more detail in his presentation. Regarding disbanding the specials and reducing the reserve, the primary document is 1D176. And related to this issue of reducing the reserve force and removing criminals, there's been some debate about what Mr. Stanišić said in the assembly session, again on the 22nd, or 23rd and 24th of November, 92. Mr. Zecevich pointed out that there initially was a mistake in the interpretation, but I want to go back to the document. It is P400 at page 17 in the English and 1718 in the BCS. Can we have the next slide? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not ready for that. But it was pointed out that the correct interpretation was they took in thieves and criminals. Because I tell you, not a single doctor picked up a rifle to defend his country, not a single intellectual. Our priority, our intentions were good, and maybe that's where we went wrong. I urge your honors to look closely at Mr. Stanisić's entire speech in that section of the assembly session, and read in context, we believe they is referring to himself and the MUP. Now, Mr. Mandić, good friend of Mr. Stanišić, at least in the context of this case, when he testified, went out of his way, I would say, not in response to a question that was put to him, but at transcript 9564, he volunteered and said, "Can I just add something, Judge?" He volunteered that they didn't mean RS MUP or Mićo Stanišić, but instead referred to powerful people who invited in the paramilitaries from outside. We say that doesn't make sense in the context of this. And one reason I say that is based on another remark attributed to Mr. Stanišić closer in time to his 27 July order about removing criminals. And that can be found in Miladic's notebook, P1755, pages 373 to 375. If we could show the next slide, please. The very same day that Mr. Stanišić had issued that order, 27 July, he and Mr. Trbojević, Deputy Prime Minister, had a meeting with Mr. Miladic, and Stanišić is noted as saying, "I had to take everyone into the police. I had to take everyone into the police. But the Army has now taken over the lines. We are now in a position to choose policemen." That's consistent with the interpretation that what he was saying in the Assembly in November 92 was that, yes, in the beginning they had to take criminals and thieves into the police. because there was a war on. Basically, if we could go on to the next slide. Noted in the same meeting, again, still Mr. Stanišić speaking apparently, he said, I sent an order this morning that within 5 days on placing a whole section of forces within the competence of the Army. That's a reference to his 1D 176 order. And he's noted as saying the Ministry of Interior has sole jurisdiction in its territory. Now, I want to play a video, Your Honor, if I have time. It's about, I don't know, a minute and a half before the break. And before we start the video, I just want to ask Your Honors to take note of what Mr. Stanišić is wearing around his neck. And not this video. Oh, sorry. Yes, this one. You can see the subtitles. I don't know if you can hear the sound. Mr. Stanišić with members of the special unit. The first one was Mr. Karadžić.
Također saradnik gospodina Karišika koji je učestvovao u istoj operaciji i komandovao svojom jedinstvom. I gospodin Abazović Zoran koji je od prvog dana sa mnom.
All right. And
sorry, am I missing something when you asked us to take note of what he's wearing around his neck?
Yes. At the beginning, I don't know if you were able to see what he was wearing around his neck. We can go back to it, but I would indicate it appears to be an Orthodox cross. You see?
Yeah, I noticed that, but
And the reason I bring that to your attention, Your Honor, is that the defense in their final trial brief portray essentially Mr. Stanišić is too nice a guy to have even thought about these crimes or doing any of these kinds of crimes. And they pointed out to his remarks on the 30th of March in Sokolac when he announced that from today we have our own Serbian MUP, and in the Assembly on the 27th of March when he was selected as the Minister of the Interior. I think on both of those occasions he made remarks to the effect that he wanted to have a professional police organization, and not one that was related to politics, and that he wanted one that would do its job of protecting all the people of all nationalities. Now the point I'm trying to make is, here's the Minister of the Interior purporting to be the representative, the protector of people of all ethnicities in the context of this conflict that was ongoing. What he's wearing, I would assert to you, is something that would not give comfort to the non-Serbs. That's not a standard issue for the police, and it seems to me that there's a message to be conveyed, and there's certainly a message that would have been received by the non-Serbs viewing that.
I follow you.
Thank you. Is it time for our first break now?
Yes.
Thank you.
20 minutes.
All rise, we will